Hello there, and welcome to Mythic Dreams. I'm so glad you found your way here. Maybe you need an escape into adventure, or maybe you're the kind of person who finds sleep in stories of courage and camaraderie. Either way, tonight's tale awaits you. Let your mind ease, your breathing slow, and feel yourself growing calm. Because tonight, we're slipping into the greenwood of medieval England, where outlaws live free beneath the oak trees and arrows fly true in defense of the poor. This is The Legend of Robin Hood, a story of rebellion, loyalty, and the fight for justice that has echoed through centuries. If stories like this help you rest, consider subscribing to wander with us again. But for now, close your eyes and let sleep find you. The first time I heard the true story of Robin Hood, I was standing beneath ancient oaks in Sherwood Forest, their gnarled branches filtering sunlight onto moss-covered stones where outlaws once walked. The guide, a weathered man with eyes that had seen 1,000 tourists come and go, leaned against a massive trunk and spoke not of the hero from storybooks, but of a flesh and blood man whose name had been whispered through these woods for centuries. I had come to Nottinghamshire for research, another academic seeking footnotes for a dissertation that few would read. Instead, I found myself following this man deeper into the greenwood, drawn by his quiet voice and the way the forest seemed to still itself to listen when he spoke of Robin. "Most get it wrong," he told me, his fingers tracing the rough bark of an oak that might have stood when Robin himself passed by. "Let me tell you what really happened." We walked deeper into Sherwood as the afternoon light grew honey-colored, the forest floor cushioned with centuries of fallen leaves. My guide, he called himself Thomas, though I suspected that wasn't his given name, moved with the ease of someone who had walked these paths since childhood. "Robin wasn't born an outlaw, you know," he said, pausing beside a clearing where deer grazed at the edges. "He was Robert of Locksley, son of a minor nobleman. This was the 12th century. King Richard, away fighting his crusades, his brother John squeezing every coin from the people to fund his own ambitions." The wind rustled through the canopy above us, and I could almost hear the whispers of those long-gone days. I had read the historical accounts, of course, the taxation, the Norman-Saxon tensions, the corruption. But standing there, these academic facts seemed to take on flesh and blood. "What turned him?" I asked, my voice hushed, as though Robin himself might be listening from the shadows between the trees. Thomas bent down and picked up an acorn, rolling it between his weathered fingers. "Injustice, plain and simple. The sheriff's men killed his father over unpaid taxes that had already been collected twice that year. Then they burned his home when he spoke against it." I could feel the weight of that moment, a young nobleman watching everything he knew turn to ash. The historical records mentioned a Robert of Locksley who lost his lands around 1188, but nothing of his fate afterward. "He fled here, to the greenwood," Thomas continued, his eyes distant as though seeing into the past. "A man alone at first, living on deer the king claimed as his own. A hanging offense, that was. But Robin had already lost everything a man could lose except his life. So what was one more crime?" The daylight was beginning to soften now, the forest taking on the hushed quality of approaching evening. A robin, the bird that gave the man his name, Thomas told me, flitted from branch to branch above our heads. He wasn't the laughing rogue from the stories, at least not at first. He was angry, bitter perhaps, but the forest changes a man. In the quiet beneath these trees, with only himself to answer to, Robin found something he'd never had before. "Freedom," I suggested. Thomas smiled slightly, the lines around his eyes deepening. Aye, freedom. But more than that, purpose. The forest doesn't care if you're Norman or Saxon, noble or peasant. Out here, a man is just a man, and Robin began to see the world differently. We came to a massive fallen oak, its trunk wider than a man is tall, moss covering it like a green blanket. Thomas sat, patting the space beside him. This isn't the Robin Hood you've seen in films, he said quietly. He didn't prance about in tights or shoot impossible arrows. He was a man who had seen the rot at the heart of the system and chose to stand outside it. Everything else, the legend, the ballads, came later. I sat beside him on the ancient tree that had perhaps stood when Robin himself walked these woods. The forest seemed to breathe around us, the first stars appearing through gaps in the leafy ceiling above. Tomorrow, Thomas said, rising and brushing the forest debris from his clothes, I'll show you where he met Little John. Morning in Sherwood Forest brings a different magic than the golden hour of dusk. Mist clings to the forest floor, transforming ordinary ferns and bracken into something from another world. Thomas was waiting for me at the edge of the woods, 2 walking sticks in hand, a small pack slung across his shoulder. There's a stream we need to visit, he said, by way of greeting, handing me one of the sticks. It's where Robin met his first true companion. The path we followed seemed to appear and disappear at Thomas's whim, winding between massive oak trees and through thickets that opened at the last moment to reveal a way through. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant tap of a woodpecker. People forget that living as an outlaw meant constant vigilance, constant hunger, Thomas said as we walked. One man alone, even one as capable as Robin, couldn't survive here for long. Not really. The stream, when we reached it, was wider than I expected, water rushing over smooth stones with a sound like whispered conversations. A fallen tree created a natural bridge across the widest part. This is where Robin met Little John, though he wasn't called that yet, Thomas said, standing at the bank. John was a forester from Hothersage, a giant of a man by the standards of the day, nearly 6.5 feet tall when most men stood 5.5 at most. I could picture it, 2 men facing each other across this very water centuries ago. They fought with quarterstaffs on a log bridge, didn't they? That's in all the stories. Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Aye, they did. But what the stories don't tell is that Robin had been 3 days without food, weak with hunger, while John was fresh and fed. It wasn't a fair fight from the start. He gestured to the log bridge. Robin lost that day, went tumbling into the cold water below. But instead of mocking him, John pulled him out, shared his bread and ale, and listened to Robin's story. A kingfisher darted past us, a flash of iridescent blue against the green backdrop. I could almost see 2 men, soaked and laughing, beginning a friendship that would echo through centuries. After John came Will Scarlet, Robin's cousin by blood, though few tellings remember that now. A hothead with a sword as quick as his temper, dressed always in the red cloth that gave him his name. Thomas led me from the stream up a gentle slope to where the trees thinned slightly, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce through to the forest floor. And Friar Tuck? I asked, following his steady pace. Ah, Tuck came later. He wasn't a true friar, you understand, but a monk who'd left his monastery after speaking too loudly against corruption he saw there. They found him living as a hermit near the edge of the forest, offering blessings to peasants who couldn't afford church tithes. We paused in a small clearing where wildflowers grew in surprising abundance. Thomas reached into his pack and produced a small bundle wrapped in cloth, bread, cheese, and early apples. He offered me half with a gesture that somehow reminded me of the hospitality Robin might have shown. "They became a brotherhood," he said, biting into an apple with a satisfying crunch. "Not the merry band of later tales, at least not at first. These were desperate men, each with his own reason for standing outside the law. But together, they found something none had alone." "Family," I suggested, tasting the sharp, tangy cheese. "Family," Thomas agreed, "but also purpose." Robin began to see that their small band could be more than just survivors. They could be a counterweight to the sheriff's men, who took and took while the people starved. A deer appeared at the edge of the clearing, regarding us with liquid eyes before bounding away in that peculiar floating gait. Thomas watched it go with a small smile. By winter of that first year, there were 7 of them living in the heart of Sherwood. They built shelters, nothing like the elaborate tree houses from the films, just simple lean-tos, and a cave they expanded into the hillside. They hunted the king's deer, yes, but they also began to watch the roads, particularly the one between Nottingham and London. The sun had risen higher now, burning away the last of the morning mist. In the distance, I could hear the faint sounds of the modern world, a plane passing overhead, the distant rumble of traffic. But here in this clearing, it was easy to imagine we had stepped centuries back in time. "Tomorrow," Thomas said, carefully rewrapping the remainder of our simple meal, "we'll speak of Marion, for there is no understanding Robin without understanding her." The rain came overnight, a gentle but persistent downpour that left the forest glistening. Droplets hung from every leaf, catching the morning light like thousands of tiny prisms. Thomas met me at the forest's edge with a waxed canvas coat that he insisted I wear. "We're going to the ruins today," he said, pulling his own hood up against the lingering drizzle. "It's where Marion's story truly begins." The ruins, when we reached them, were little more than stone foundations half buried in earth, the remnants of walls emerging from the forest floor like broken teeth. Yet there was something haunting about them, these fragments of human ambition reclaimed by nature. "This was Kirklees Priory once," Thomas explained, running his hand along a moss-covered stone. "Not the original buildings, mind you. Those were gone long before our time. But it stood on this spot for centuries." I'd read about Kirklees in my research, mentioned primarily as the place where Robin Hood supposedly died. But Thomas had brought us here to speak of Marion. "She wasn't some simpering noble girl waiting to be rescued," he said firmly. "Marion was the daughter of Sir Richard at Lee, educated beyond what was common for women of her time. She could read Latin and Greek, kept accounts better than most clerks, and had a mind that questioned everything." The rain had stopped now, but water still dripped from the canopy above, creating a gentle percussion around us. I could picture this educated noblewoman, trapped within the confines of medieval expectations. "The sheriff wanted her," Thomas continued, picking his way carefully through the ruins. "Not for love, though he might have called it that, but for her lands and the alliance with her father. She was a prize to be claimed." He stopped at what might once have been a doorway, now just an opening in a crumbling wall. "She came here first, to the priory, choosing the life of a novice over marriage to a man she despised. But even here, she wasn't beyond the sheriff's reach. A robin, the bird again, landed on a nearby branch, its red breast bright against the green foliage. It watched us with a curious tilt of its head before flying away. "How did she meet Robin?" I asked, following Thomas through the ghostly outline of what had once been human habitation. "At the Nottingham Fair," he said, a smile warming his weathered face. She had come with the other novices to sell herbs and medicines. Robin was there too, in disguise, gathering information about the sheriff's movements. Their eyes met across the crowded market square, or so the story goes. It sounded like something from a romantic ballad, but Thomas's expression held no mockery, only a distant fondness, as though he could see these long-dead people clearly. But their real meeting came later. The sheriff's men came to the priory, demanding taxes beyond what they could pay. When the abbess refused, they began to take payment in grain and livestock meant to feed the women through winter. Thomas led me to a fallen log, surprisingly dry beneath its mossy covering. We sat, and he continued his tale, as though unspooling a precious thread from memory. Robin and his men arrived just as the soldiers were loading the last of the grain. It was Marion who stood before them, not cowering, but arguing the law, pointing out that religious houses were exempt from the particular tax they claimed to collect. I could imagine her, straight-backed and claw-eyed, facing armed men with nothing but her conviction and knowledge. She impressed Robin, not with beauty, though she had that too, but with courage. And later, when the sheriff's persistence made the priory unsafe for her, it was to Robin she turned. The forest around us had grown quiet, as if listening to the tale. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a patch of wild violets growing among the stones. Choosing the forest over safety was no small thing, Thomas said softly, especially for a woman raised in comfort. But Marion saw in Robin and his men something worth the hardship, a chance to live by one's own principles rather than bend to unjust authority. He rose, brushing fragments of bark from his clothing. She brought more than just another pair of hands to their band. She brought knowledge of herb lore and healing, connections to sympathizers in the villages and towns, and a perspective the men lacked. We began making our way back through the ruins toward the denser forest. I found myself wondering how much of what Thomas told me could be verified historically, and how much was the embellishment of centuries of storytelling. Yet something in his quiet certainty made me want to believe. "Tomorrow," he said, as we reached the edge of the clearing, "we'll speak of the sheriff, for every hero needs a worthy opponent, and he was more complex than the villain your stories have made him. The town of Nottingham has grown and changed over the centuries, but its medieval heart still beats beneath the modern facade." Thomas led me through narrow streets that twisted and turned in ways no city planner would approve today, a legacy of their organic growth in an earlier time. "The sheriff's castle stood there," he said, pointing to a spot now occupied by a modern civic building. Not a true castle like the king's, but a fortified manor house with a palisade wall, grand enough to impress the locals, secure enough to withstand all but a determined siege. We found a small cafe with a view of the old market square. Over steaming cups of tea, Thomas continued his tale, his voice low enough that only I could hear. History remembers him as the villain, the sheriff of Nottingham. But he was Sir Guy of Gisborne. And to understand, Robin, you must understand that Sir Guy believed himself the hero of his own story. A cold breeze swept across the square, making me grateful for the warmth of the tea between my hands. I had expected Thomas to paint the sheriff as a purely evil figure, but once again, he surprised me. He was a Norman, of course, placed in power by Prince John while King Richard was away. His job was simple: extract enough taxes to fill the prince's coffers while maintaining order in the Shire. Do this well, and advancement would follow. Thomas gazed out at the square, watching modern tourists where medieval peasants once would have gathered. The trouble was, the people had already been taxed beyond endurance. Failed harvests had left many on the edge of starvation. Every coin taken meant less bread on tables, less seed for the next planting. I thought of the historical records I'd studied, the famines of the late 12th century, the crushing taxation to fund foreign wars. The academic statistics suddenly represented real hunger, real suffering. Sir Guy wasn't born cruel, Thomas continued, surprising me again. He was ambitious, yes, rigid in his thinking, but the system he served demanded cruelty, and over time, he provided what was required. We finished our tea and walked toward the remains of the old city wall, a fragment preserved amid newer buildings, like a memory that refuses to fade. Robin's first encounter with the sheriff came after a tax collection gone wrong. One of the villagers, a potter with a crippled hand, couldn't pay. The sheriff's men took his only cow, which meant not just lost milk, but certain death for the family come winter. Thomas's pace slowed as he continued the tale. Robin and John intercepted the tax collectors in the forest. They took the cow, along with the rest of the collection, and returned the animal to the potter under cover of darkness. A simple act of rebellion, but I could imagine how it would have resonated with people who had no other hope of justice. The sheriff was furious, of course, not just at the lost revenue, but at the challenge to authority. He increased patrols in the forest, offered rewards for information. And when that failed, he began to punish entire villages for Robin's actions. We had reached a small, ancient church tucked between newer buildings. Its weathered stone spoke of centuries of prayers and hopes. This became their battleground, Thomas said, gesturing at the landscape around us. Not just the forest, but the towns, the villages, the hearts and minds of the people. Robin would strike at the sheriff's men, free prisoners, return what had been taken. The sheriff would retaliate, tighten his grip, make examples of those who showed sympathy to the outlaws. Inside the church, cool shadows wrapped around us like a cloak. Candles flickered in a side chapel where a few modern pilgrims knelt in prayer. Thomas lowered his voice further. Their conflict became personal when the sheriff realized Marion had joined Robin's band. He had wanted her for himself, you see, and her choice felt like a direct rejection. I could almost see it, the proud Norman knight, the system of power he represented, confronted by those who simply refused to accept that power as legitimate, not through grand rebellion, but through persistent, stubborn defiance. The most dangerous thing Robin did, Thomas said as we emerged back into daylight, wasn't stealing gold or freeing prisoners. It was showing people they had a choice, that even the sheriff's authority had limits. We walked back toward the edge of town where the forest began, the boundary between civilization and wilderness that had defined Robin's existence. Tomorrow, Thomas said as we parted, I'll show you how they lived in the greenwood and how Robin's small acts of defiance became the legend of a man who stole from the rich to give to the poor. Dawn painted Sherwood with gentle brush strokes of pink and gold when I met Thomas at our usual spot. He carried a small sack over his shoulder and wore a knowing smile that suggested today's journey would be special. We're going to the heart of the forest, he said, by way of greeting, to the place where Robin and his band made their true home. The path we followed seemed to wind deeper into the woods than our previous excursions, passing beneath ancient oaks whose massive trunks spoke of centuries of silent witness. The morning dew soaked the hems of our trousers as we brushed through ferns and undergrowth. Most people think Robin simply camped beneath the trees, Thomas said as we walked. But surviving the English winter requires more substantial shelter. They found a network of caves in a limestone outcropping, natural chambers they expanded and connected. After nearly an hour of walking, we came to a rocky hillside, partially hidden by thick vegetation. Thomas pushed aside a curtain of ivy to reveal the dark mouth of a cave. This isn't the actual site. That's been lost to time or deliberately obscured in the tellings, he explained. But it would have been something like this. A hidden entrance, defensible, with escape routes known only to the band. He produced a modern electric lantern from his bag, its beam cutting through the darkness as we ventured just inside the entrance. The temperature dropped immediately, the cool dampness a stark contrast to the warming day outside. From here, Robin and his men would venture out to monitor the roads, particularly those used by tax collectors and wealthy merchants, Thomas said, his voice echoing slightly against the stone walls. Contrary to popular belief, they didn't rob everyone who passed through the forest, only those connected to the sheriff or Prince John, and those who could clearly afford to share their wealth. We returned to the sunlight, finding a fallen log nearby where we could rest. Thomas reached into his sack and pulled out 2 apples, offering one to me. The fruit was crisp and sweet, its juice running down my fingers as I bit into it. Their first significant robbery came about 3 months after Robin fled to the forest, he continued. The sheriff's tax collector was returning to Nottingham with a substantial sum, accompanied by 4 armed guards. Robin and Little John, they had only each other then, ambushed them at a narrow part of the road. I could picture it clearly. 2 desperate men against 5, the element of surprise their only advantage. They took the money, but what happened next is what began the legend, Thomas said, his eyes distant, as though watching the scene unfold. Instead of keeping it for themselves, Robin divided it into smaller portions. Over the next week, he and John visited the villages that had been most heavily taxed, leaving coins wrapped in green cloth on doorsteps during the night. The simplicity of the act struck me. Not grand heroism from ballads, but quiet redistribution that meant survival for people pushed to the edge. Word spread, of course. The sheriff was furious, doubling his patrols and questioning villagers. But something had changed. The people began actively hiding evidence of Robin's visits, leaving food at the forest's edge, warning of the sheriff's movements. A bird called overhead, its song carrying through the trees like a message from another time. Thomas listened for a moment before continuing. As their band grew, so did their operations. They began targeting the Bishop of Hereford, who was notorious for living in luxury while demanding tithes from starving peasants. They intercepted shipments of goods meant for Prince John's supporters. Each time, the wealth was redistributed to those who needed it most. Thomas reached again into his sack and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside were bread, cheese, and dried meat, a simple meal that reminded me of what Robin's band might have shared. One of their most famous acts happened during the winter of 1190, he said as we ate. A particularly harsh season had followed a poor harvest. The sheriff, under pressure from above, continued collecting taxes even as people starved. Robin and his men broke into the castle stores one night and took grain, salt meat, and preserved vegetables, enough to feed 3 villages through the worst months. The forest around us seemed to approve of the telling, sunlight dappling through leaves in shifting patterns across the forest floor. It wasn't just food and money they gave people, Thomas added quietly. It was hope, the knowledge that someone was standing against injustice, even if they themselves couldn't risk it. We finished our meal in companionable silence, the forest alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the scurrying of unseen creatures, the the distant tap of a woodpecker. The ballads that came later simplified it all, of course, Thomas said eventually. Made Robin into a perfect hero, the sheriff a perfect villain. The truth had more shadows in it, more complexity. There were robberies that went wrong, innocent people caught in the conflict. He stood, brushing crumbs from his clothes. Robin carried those burdens heavily, but he never stopped believing that what they did was necessary, standing between the powerful and the powerless when no one else would. As we began our walk back toward the forest's edge, I found myself wondering again how Thomas knew these details, these inner thoughts of a man dead for over 800 years. Yet the forest itself seemed to confirm his words, the very air vibrating with the echo of old stories. "Tomorrow," he said, as the trees began to thin near the end of our journey. "We'll speak of King Richard's return, and how it changed everything for Robin and his band." Rain fell in a steady patter against the windows of the small pub where Thomas had suggested we meet. Outside, Sherwood Forest was a dark smudge against the grey horizon, the trees swaying in the autumn wind. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the ancient timber beams overhead. "Not all our stories need to be told in the forest itself," Thomas said, settling into a worn leather chair across from mine. "And this part of the tale deserves the comfort of a fire and good ale." The pub was nearly empty this early in the day, just a few locals reading newspapers or conversing quietly in the corners. Our drinks arrived: dark, rich ale for Thomas, tea for myself, and he continued the story that had begun to feel like a journey through time itself. It was spring of 1192, when word reached England that King Richard had been captured on his way back from the Crusades, held for ransom by Duke Leopold of Austria. For Robin and his band, the news brought mixed emotions. Thomas took a slow sip of his ale, savouring it before continuing. Richard had been an absent king, one who cared more for foreign wars than his own people's suffering. Yet he represented legitimate authority against Prince John's grasping ambition. Through the windows, I could see the rain intensifying, drops merging into rivulets that streamed down the glass. It created a cocoon around our conversation, isolating us in this moment of storytelling. The ransom demanded for Richard was enormous, 150,000 marks, a sum that required taxing every free man in whole England. Even Robin understood the necessity of this particular collection, though it pained him to see people giving what they could ill afford, even for their king's return. I'd read about this ransom in my historical research, a truly staggering amount for the time, equivalent to many millions in today's currency. "What most tales don't tell," Thomas continued, his voice dropping slightly, "is that Robin contributed to the ransom himself. The band had accumulated a significant store of wealth from their activities, hidden in various caches throughout the forest. Robin gave nearly all of it toward Richard's freedom." The fire popped and sparked, sending a shower of embers up the chimney. I could imagine Robin making this decision, a man outside the law, choosing to uphold the system when it aligned with his sense of justice. Richard returned to England in March of 1194. The stories say Robin attended the great tournament at Nottingham disguised as a beggar, revealing himself to win the archery contest with a single perfect shot. Thomas smiled slightly, the firelight playing across his weathered features. Perhaps he did. What's certain is that Richard, hearing tales of the outlaw who had defied his brother's authority, was curious rather than vengeful. He ventured into Sherwood himself with a small party of trusted knights. Outside, a crack of thunder punctuated his words, as if the very elements were adding dramatic emphasis to the tale. They say the king dressed as an abbot, knowing Robin often targeted wealthy churchmen. Robin's band intercepted them, as expected, and invited the supposed abbot to dine with them in their forest hall, an outdoor clearing with a great oak table they'd constructed for gatherings. I could picture it vividly. The forest clearing, the rough-hewn table laden with venison and forest fruits, the king in disguise among outlaws who would normally fear his justice. During the meal, Richard revealed himself. Robin immediately knelt, offering his life in penance for his crimes. But the king was shrewd enough to recognize the value of a man like Robin, especially one who commanded such loyalty from both his band and the common people. The rain began to ease, sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast dappled patterns across our table. Thomas watched this change in the weather with a satisfied nod, as though the elements themselves were responding to his storytelling. Richard offered Robin a pardon, not just for himself, but for all his men. More than that, he offered him a place at court, a chance to serve the king directly and work for change from within the system, rather than outside it. Thomas fell silent for a moment, tracing a pattern in the condensation on his ale glass. When he spoke again, his voice carried a hint of melancholy. Robin accepted. After years in the greenwood, he returned to society, to stone walls and formal clothes, to the hierarchies and protocols he had rejected. He became Sir Robert of Locksley once more, his outlawry officially erased. The pub had begun to fill as the afternoon progressed, locals coming in from the rain, their voices creating a gentle background murmur to our conversation. Some of his band followed him back to civilization. Others, like Little John, found they had grown too accustomed to forest freedom to return to the constraints of society. They remained in Sherwood, living quietly, no longer outlaws but never fully rejoining the world beyond the trees. Thomas finished his ale, setting the glass down with a gentle finality. For a time, Robin served Richard well. The king valued his insight into the suffering of common people, his understanding of the corruption that had taken root during the royal absence. Small reforms were made, some officials replaced. I sensed we were approaching the end of Robin's story, and found myself strangely reluctant to reach it, as though a spell would be broken when the tale concluded. But Robin was a creature of the forest by then, Thomas said softly. The air in the castle felt too still, the walls too confining. The politics of court chafed against his direct nature, and something of the magic that had sustained him in Sherwood seemed to fade a little more with each passing day in the world of men. Outside, the sun had fully emerged, turning raindrops on the window into tiny prisms that scattered rainbow light across our table. Tomorrow, Thomas said, rising from his chair, we'll walk to the place where Robin's story ended, and where his legend truly began. Our final day dawned clear and cool, the sky a perfect autumn blue. Thomas waited at our meeting place with a solemnity I hadn't seen before, his usual gentle humor replaced by something deeper, more reverent. Today we walk to Kirklees, he said simply, where Robin's journey ended. The path we took led away from the heart of Sherwood, across fields where medieval villages once stood, now marked only by subtle undulations in the landscape. We walked mostly in silence, the rhythm of our steps a meditation on all that had come before. Robin remained at court for nearly a year after King Richard's return, Thomas finally said, as we crested a small rise. But the walls closed in around him more with each passing day. The compromises of politics, the slow pace of change, the distance from the forest, all of it wore away at his spirit. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with effortless grace. I thought of Robin, a man of action constrained by ceremony and procedure. He left the court quietly, one spring night in 1195, left behind his fine clothes, his restored title, the comfort and safety he had regained. By dawn he was back in Sherwood. The landscape opened before us, rolling hills dotted with trees, a patchwork of fields stretching toward the horizon. In the distance, I could make out stone ruins similar to those we had visited when discussing Marion. Somerville, his old companions, rejoined him. Little John had never truly left the forest, and Will Scarlet returned within days of hearing Robin was back. But it wasn't the same. The sheriff had been replaced, the worst abuses of power curtailed under Richard's more attentive rule. We crossed a small stone bridge over a brook. The water below moved with gentle purpose, unhurried yet unstoppable in its journey. For a time they lived quietly in the greenwood, not as outlaws now, but as men who had chosen the forest over civilization. They still helped those in need, still stood against injustice when they found it, but the urgency of their earlier days had faded. As we drew nearer to the ruins, I could see they were the remains of Kirklees Priory, the same place Thomas had taken me to speak of Marion. Now we returned for Robin's sake. The end came 15 years later, Thomas said, his voice soft but clear in the still air. Robin had grown ill, a slow fever that seemed to drain his strength day by day. Marion had died 2 winters before, and something in him had dimmed with her passing. We reached the ruins, walking slowly among the scattered stones that had once formed walls and chambers. Birds nested in crevices, and wildflowers pushed up between fragments of masonry, life continuing its cycle among the remnants of human creation. He came here to Kirklees, to his cousin who was prioress, seeking healing. Some versions say she betrayed him, that she was in league with Sir Roger of Doncaster, an old enemy, and opened Robin's vein under the pretense of bloodletting, letting him bleed too long. Thomas shook his head slightly. I don't believe that tale. More likely his time had simply come, as it does for all men. He had lived hard and fast, and even legends must eventually rest. We stopped at a spot where a stone marker stood, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. It wasn't grand, just a simple memorial surrounded by wild grasses that swayed in the gentle breeze. They say that as he lay dying, Robin asked for his bow one last time. With the strength that remained to him, he loosed a single arrow through the window, asking to be buried where it fell. I looked out across the rolling landscape beyond the ruins, imagining the flight of that final arrow, a life force spent, a soul set free. Little John was with him at the end, the great, strong man who had been his first true companion, wept as Robin breathed his last. And when the arrow landed, John carried his friend's body to that spot and buried him with his own hands. Thomas fell silent, allowing the weight of the ending to settle around us. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Is any of it true? I finally asked. The historical Robin Hood is so elusive in the records. Some scholars doubt he existed at all. Thomas smiled then, the warmth returning to his eyes. Does it matter? The forest remembers. The stones remember. The stories remember, passed down through generations, changing with each telling, yet keeping some essential truth at their core. He reached down and picked up a small, smooth stone from among the ruins, turning it over in his palm before offering it to me. What matters is what Robin stood for, the idea that one person standing against injustice can make a difference, that the powerful aren't always right, that the law isn't always just, that sometimes the truest path lies outside the established order. I accepted the stone, feeling its cool weight in my hand, a tangible connection to this place, this story, this moment. The legend grew after his death. Ballads and tales spread across England, then beyond. With each retelling, Robin became more skilled, his aim more perfect, his moral compass more unfailing. The man became the myth. We began walking back toward Sherwood, leaving the quiet ruins behind. The afternoon light had turned golden, casting long shadows across the land. Yet beneath the myth remains the truth of a man who saw suffering and refused to look away, who used what power he had, his bow, his wits, his band of loyal friends, to stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. As Sherwood came into view again, its ancient trees a dark line against the horizon, I found myself reluctant to leave this story behind. For 5 days, Thomas had led me through a version of Robin Hood, more human, more complex, and somehow more inspiring than any I had encountered in books or films. "Why tell me all this?" I asked, as we paused at the forest's edge. "Why take a random academic through this journey?" Thomas looked at me with those weathered eyes that seemed to hold centuries within them. Stories need to be kept alive, not just preserved in books or lectures, but truly alive, felt and understood in the heart. You'll carry this one forward now, in your own way. The sun was setting as we said our goodbyes, casting the forest in hues of amber and gold. As Thomas turned to leave, I called after him. "Will I see you again?" He paused, looking back with a smile that seemed to bridge centuries. "The forest is always here," he said simply, "and stories have a way of continuing." I watched him walk away, his figure gradually blending with the shadows of the ancient trees until I couldn't tell where the man ended and the forest began. If you've enjoyed this journey through the legend of Robin Hood, take a moment to breathe deeply and let the forest's whispers settle in your heart. Subscribe to our channel for more tales that bridge the gap between history and legend, told as if shared beside a crackling fire on a cool autumn evening.